point, we've spent some time already talking about the discussion of sorts between William Clifford and William James, and whether or not we have a right to believe something without sufficient evidence. Now, already on Blackboard, I've posted a clip from Comedy Central, um, a clip from Stephen Colbert from way back in 2005, the very first episode of a show called The Colbert Report with Stephen Colbert. He does a show now. I can't remember which of the late night shows it is that he does now. But on this first episode of the Colbert Report, he coined a word, at least in modern use. If you actually look it up in an etymological dictionary, you'll find that it actually had been used in the 1800s. So he didn't invent the syllables as construed. But the word is truthiness. Now, while, again, the word had existed before in the past in some obscure settings, the Oxford English Dictionary has actually added this word to its dictionary. If you go to the Oxford English Dictionary and look it up, and the Oxford English Dictionary is one of those dictionaries where if you try and go to their website and look something up, you're going to have to pay a premium in order to get into their vaults. You'll either have to get a hard copy, or I think through the US Aiken Library, you should be able to get to the Oxford English Dictionary, but you'll see the word truthiness in there, and it comes from this segment. I think it ended up being a word of the year in 2006. So this was 15 years ago. And I want to explore this concept a little bit and see its application for engineering ethics. It has very much to do with Clifford and James and belief and epistemology. That is how we know what we know. And how we know what we know and how we talk about what we know it might seem peripheral to the notion of ethics, but it's actually quite central and focal to the dominion of ethics. So, because that Comedy Central episode is trademarked material, I can post the video, but I can't post the video in here in segments on YouTube. So I am going to look at parts of it. Again, the video's up there for reference. I'm going to look at parts of it and analyze it a bit. Then I want to go from that into Harry Frankfurt's book, on bullshit, which I've already posted up on Blackboard. And yes, bullshit is a technical philosophical term. I one time said that in class already. It might have seemed like a joke. It wasn't. We'll take a look at a little bit of his book on bullshit. It's actually an essay that was published in a book about this big. We'll take a look at a little bit of that. So what does Colbert have to say about truthiness? He says, what it is, he gives this example of, talking about the Panama Canal, who's, Encyclopedia Britannica to tell me that the Panama Canal was finished in 1914. If I want to say it happened in 1941, that's my right. Well, is it? Yeah, certainly the freedom to say whatever you want could be, whether it's true or not, is an aspect of of freedom of speech. In fact, Colbert, the whole show, the Colbert Report, is the comedian actor Stephen Colbert. He's doing what he's doing in a kind of character. Plato has talked about that. One of the reasons he didn't like drama was that acting and art is filled with lies. It's people pretending to be who they're not. It's interesting that Plato said that because Plato does all of his writing as dialogues of characters talking to each other in conversations that never happened. It's like he wrote plays. But he doesn't like a lot of art because it's deception. When you look at a painting of something, even if you look at the most hyper-realistic, Plato has no concept of hyper-realistic painting, but even if you've ever looked at a drawing or a painting where it looks super real, or say like a 4K PS4 Pro video game, this looks realer than real. Yeah, and Plato says that realness, that hyper-reality is a kind of a lie. You also see that in the work of a philosopher named Jean Baudrillard, who wrote a book called Simulacra and Simulation, where that's where really the theory that we're living inside a simulation comes from, and it comes from things seeming more realer than real. If you ever heard that, again, the book is Simulacra and Simulation. If you're interested, I can send you parts of it. But the point here that I want to emphasize is wanting to believe something because it's asserted. That is itself a right. Again, this is of course satirical, but I think it's worth exploring. He says in the next section that ultimately there is a dialectic, some sort of opposition between those who think with their head and those who know with their heart. And he gives a couple of ridiculous examples. He mentions Harriet Myers, who is a candidate for the Supreme Court in the mid-aughts. That, if you notice, there is no Harriet Myers in the Supreme Court today, so that did not happen. Or about the impetus for the Iraq War being something that people felt as true. Maybe the Iraq War was not justified. Maybe Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. But didn't it feel right to take out Saddam Hussein? There's this notion that knowledge and rightness depends on a kind of feeling rather than a kind of knowing, and that feeling has supplanted knowing. I mentioned this earlier in the semester too, that something else I've seen transpire over the last, really since this time, about the past 15 years, is when people are speaking. It's one thing colloquially, like if someone says this to me just in the hallway or something, I'm not going to mind it. But in terms of especially academic writing, and when people are making very like polemical points, to couch sentences of propositions of fact with the following language: I feel that. Some people do it in their papers. I'm going to tell you, don't do it in your papers. Where someone says, I feel that this is true. Now, that's a bit vague the way I couched it. Like I said before, you can feel feelings. You can feel emotions. You can say, I feel happy. I don't doubt that you're feeling happy. You're talking about your own mental states. You're kind of talking about your own inner consciousness. Cool. That's fine. I understand in certain contexts, I feel like you're doing this here, like that kind of sentimental way of talking, but you don't feel that 2 + 2 = 4. Sometimes we can have a sense of certainty about something, or a sense of probability about something. Like I feel like it's going to rain tomorrow. I don't know why, I just kind of feel it. We can use that language, but often we couch notions of truth and certainty in the language of emotion. And Colbert is satirically saying here that that's part of the problem, is that we take feeling as fact. Now, I've heard certain YouTube personalities like Ben Shapiro say things like, facts don't care about your feelings. And that's been kind of a mantra of certain personalities on the internet. But there's a sense in which, while I think usually that's used in a context to kind of punch down at people, in my experience, there is something to it where there is a disconnect between facts and feelings. Because you feel something to be the case does not mean it's the case. But also, just because you say certain facts, sometimes, ironically, what ends up happening is people will constitute what they think are a set of facts that are bound together only by sentiment. So sometimes people, regardless of ideology, could be people on the left or on the right, could be libertarians or communists. Sometimes people will affirm a particular position that's rooted in their feelings about something. This is very similar to the emotivism that we talked about earlier in the semester. That people think something is true simply because it feels to be true, not because there's any certainty about it. This can happen with certain conspiracy theories, like 9/11 was an inside job. The coronavirus is caused by 5G networks. Vaccines cause autism. And even if someone says, yeah, no, none of the evidence bears it out, nevertheless, doesn't it feel like it's true? For example, sociologists will often talk about the murder of, and there's a what movie is it? There's a movie called The Boondock Saints that brings this up in the opening 10 minutes of the movie. In the late 1960s, apparently a woman named Kitty Genovese was murdered in New York City, and the story goes she was being murdered in an alley, assaulted and murdered in an alley. There were something like 40 people watching the event, and no one called the police. And isn't that an indictment on humanity? That here were these people seeing what was happening, all these witnesses, nobody called the police, nobody did anything, no one tried to save her. Except, and while that story has been taken kind of at face value, that, according to the evidence, did not transpire that way whatsoever. That is a narrative that's been pushed again and again to the point where it just, well, if someone even told you, this is what happens when you've been told a particular version of a story so many times, then when someone tells you, oh, that's not true, but it feels true, Okay, another example would be something like, Columbus was the one who discovered that the world was round. Nope. That's something you were probably told in elementary school. I know I was told it in elementary school. And so whenever it gets challenged, you kind of feel this, uh, no, that's, that feels, because it feels right. There's also an element of the Dunning-Kruger effect going on there. Now, the Dunning-Kruger effect is something that sociologists talk about that's twofold. One, it's that people who are really well informed in something underestimate the knowledge of others. That's one element. That's not the element I want to focus on, but I'll just to explain it. This is one element of what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. So I'm a philosopher. So what happens to me sometimes, I recognize it myself, and I think it's good to be self-conscious this way. Since I'm a philosopher, like Plato, Aristotle, Conxy, Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mill, this stuff seems really obvious to me, and it's so obvious that I expect kind of everyone else to know about it too. Except I know I'm a philosopher, and no one really knows about philosophy except for philosophers. But that's kind of where my mind wants to go. Like, you don't know who Immanuel Kant is? You don't know what the categorical imperative is? How stupid are you? And this is true. You might, if you're like a big fan of a particular sport, and you're like, wait, like, let's say you're really into football, and you're like, oh, you don't know what a two-point conversion is? You don't know what a sack means? You don't know that you don't know that there's no such thing as a fifth down? You kind of look down on people that don't know otherwise because you expect everyone else to know. If you're a music major, you expect you don't know what mixolydian mode is. You don't know how to convert from, major to minor to. You can't play a C major seventh sustained chord. And you don't know what the difference between that and a C major chord or a C minor chord is, and you don't know what a diminished triad is. Music, okay? Oh, you know what 4/4 beat is, but you don't understand what a 5/4 or a 7/4 or a regular meter is. And if you're going, I like music, I have no idea what those things mean. Yeah, exactly. Musicians are this way. I know this because my father's a pianist. So when you have specialized knowledge, you kind of expect that everyone else has specialized knowledge. And that's one aspect of the Dunning-Kruger effect. The other end, or the other proposition of the Dunning-Kruger effect is, so I'll say it again. First element of the Dunning-Kruger effect is that people who are informed about something, they have a great knowledge of something, expect that everyone else is kind of just as informed as well. And when they don't have that kind of information, they go, man, you are so stupid. They kind of overestimate, not the intelligence, because I really want to stress this too, especially as a philosopher. There's a distinction between intelligence and knowledge. So intelligence is someone's ability to cope with information. I'd also just make that distinct from wisdom as well. But so intelligence, wisdom, and knowledge. So intelligence is capacity for dealing with information, especially if you haven't dealt with information before. Knowledge is simply what particular bits of data that you've stored up. So for example, I would say I'm knowledgeable about philosophy, and I think I could say, without being arrogant, that I'm probably more knowledgeable than most of you, but I would expect that in certain realms and elements, many of you are more knowledgeable about me in other things. This just happens to be my specialty. You probably have your own, and that's fine. But sometimes when someone doesn't know something because their expertise makes them know it, they think of other people as stupid, when people are not stupid, but ignorant. Ignorant in the benign sense of simply not knowing something. We use sometimes the word ignorant to mean stupid. It doesn't. It means someone that doesn't know something. So you might be ignorant in Mandarin. You might not know how to speak Mandarin or how to read it. That doesn't mean you're stupid. It just means you don't know something. There are certain things where we say, sometimes we throw around the phrase common sense. We expect people should know things. Sometimes we do that out of this first element of the Dunning-Kruger effect. But the second element of the Dunning-Kruger effect is that people who are not informed, or people that do not have expertise in something, overestimate their own intelligence about something. So, for example, the way that I think the researchers Dunning-Kruger emphasized this, I think there's one experiment. I might post this up on Blackboard if I can find it. You can find it with your own library means. Again, Dunning-Kruger is that you take, I can't remember how many they took. You take, say, 100 American students in a math class. You take 100 Swedish students in a math class. The Swedish students all said, "Oh, ask them how good are you at math?" And they would go, "Oh, we're not very good." And you ask the American students, "How good are you at math?" And they're all like, "Yeah, we're pretty awesome." And the Swedish students score higher than the Americans, but the Swedish students had a sense of a more of a sense of not humility, but go like we're not very good at this. But the Americans had an overestimated sense of how good we are, but they were wrong more often. And so this is what the Dunning-Kruger effect does. One, it's in this second element of it. You overestimate your own expertise when you have no reasons for doing so. Further, another element of this is kind of a bias that gets enforced where, I can't remember exactly what this is called, but there's this bias that coalesces where when people tell you that you're wrong about something and you show them the evidence to do it, sometimes we do this, especially when we argue with people on the internet or people at Thanksgiving dinner. If you show someone that they're wrong about something and you bring them evidence and you try and convince them, most people, not being as rational as we think we are, do not just go, oh yes, you've presented your evidence, I will accept your proposition. Most people, if you confront them with evidence, show them how they're mistaken, actually, to use an antiquated expression, harden their hearts and hold their belief even more strongly. We become very stubborn and callous in our beliefs when we're challenged. So if someone, for example, believes that vaccines cause autism, here's 20 studies why vaccines don't cause autism, the likelihood is that person will actually believe more strongly that vaccines cause autism, and this ends up being kind of problematic. This is simply to demonstrate that a lot of our beliefs rely on feelings, and many of them do. But it's when we consign ourselves to not investigate evidence, to base ourselves on feeling, that's what truthiness gets at. Truthiness is the sense that something's true because doesn't it feel true? Doesn't it feel right? Don't you just know in your heart? I love when one of the weirdest things in say I know I've mentioned this before. The Empire Strikes Back there's the scene where Darth Vader is talking to Luke Skywalker, and it's the scene where Darth Vader tells Luke, "No, I am your father." And Luke says, "No, that's not true. That's impossible." Darth Vader says, "Search your feelings. You know it to be true." Why are the feelings the domain of evidence? I want, Mulvey Porch to come out with a paternity test showing me that, Darth Vader is the father. We don't see that. We see the sense of search your feelings, or you know it in your heart to be true. You see that kind of language pop up sometime. And I think, again, I want to stress that feelings are important. But if you've ever had a strong emotional experience, you know that feelings can lie to you. If you've ever been, for example, as I have, through a really difficult breakup, for example, you might think to yourself like, "Oh, I can't live without this person. Oh, this person means so. I can't. This is the word. I can't go on living without this." Then time passes, and you look back on the feelings that you had, and you're almost embarrassed about the feelings that you experienced. I can't believe I ever felt that strongly. I can't believe I ever thought that I could live without this person. We know that feelings can deceive us, especially when we're in adolescence. Okay, you ever had like a strong crush, for example, and you're just like, I love this person. Newsflash, you don't, but you think you do, and especially your feelings are telling you. I don't want to reify feelings, but often feelings can distort our sense of reality. That's why there are these ancient Greek philosophers called the Stoics who said, listen, feelings are basically like mirages. All right, just like sometimes on a hot day, if you look down this, like you're driving in your car on a hot day, you look down the street, it almost looks like the street is melting, about half a mile away. Look, if you were in the desert, you'd think there's an oasis there. There's not. That's just heat waves causing this bending of the light, such that we think there's something there that's not. And the Stoics say feelings are like that. So stop getting wrapped up in feelings. Stop groaning about things. Stop crying and whining about everything, because it's not that those things that happen to you. It's not that you don't need to. When something bad happens to you, yeah, it can be bad. But usually, the Stoics will say, much of what's going on is not what happens to you, but how you're reacting to it. Again, Stoic philosophy can kind of be summarized in that phrase where you hear, life is 10% what happens to you, 90% how you react to it. The Stoics didn't say that, but I think that's a good encapsulation of at least the Stoic philosophy of Epictetus, where just mind your emotions. When you feel sad, that sadness distorts. When you feel in love, A feeling of in love distorts. Happiness distorts. Intoxication is a kind of distortion. I feel happy because I'm buzzed and high. You're not happy, but you think you are because your feelings lie to you because feelings are stupid. I'm not saying that. The Stoics said that. But it is related to this notion of truthiness, about something being true, not because it can be confirmed, not because it can be demonstrated, but because it feels true. Okay? He says, cold air that is, truth comes to us in the gut. He says at the end, the truthiness is anyone can read the news to you. I promise to feel the news at you. You can't prove truthiness. You can't prove truthiness with facts. You can only prove truthiness with more truthiness, a process that's called truthinessness. Okay, now that's the notion of truthiness. But I want to, and it seems satirical, and it's played for laughs. But as time has gone on, I think this is a helpful way of understanding how we kind of disseminate reality today. Now, I know there's been talk today about things, like especially in the last couple of years, about notions of alternative facts and fake news and those kinds of little pithy statements being thrown around. And I've heard some commentators say that's something this is something new. This is something that's post-truth. It's really not new. The dissemination about it is new. The fact that we have social media is new. For example, like in this current pandemic right now, what makes this so different? Its scale is huge, of course, because our populations are bigger today. But we had a pandemic in this country 100 years ago, what was called the Spanish flu, just as devastating in many ways for the time. And then there were no state or federal responses. There was no epidemiology at the time to the same degree. There was germ theory, but there wasn't really an understanding of how viruses worked until the 1930s. This was I want to say 1918 when the Spanish flu occurred in the United States. It actually originated probably from the Midwest and not Spain, but Spain, since Spain was neutral in World War I, was the first country to really document what was going on with it. That's why it's called the Spanish flu, so to speak. But again, then the circumstances were different because there was no epidemiology. That's the study of how epidemics work, and there was no really study of how viruses work. Again, that didn't really happen until the 1930s. Today, however, we have social media, and so notions of both fact and sentiment are equally publicized. All of us, especially those of you who are younger, just this social media, which I don't denigrate. I know some people would denigrate social media. I don't. I think that social media is great. I don't think every single aspect of it is great, but I think there are so many great things about it. But one of the things about it that's interesting is that we have this instantaneous communication, so we're all disseminating information immediately. Something happens today, we all get it today. Something happened, say, in the American Civil War, 1863. You might be able to get a wire into Abraham Lincoln, and that's pretty quick. In fact, in the American Civil War is when stuff started happening fairly instantaneously with like tactical knowledge, like, hey, we won this battle. Beep, 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 Morse code, we won this battle. Before that, like Gutenberg's printing press, early 1500s, late 1400s, where it might take like a month for something to get out, but it was getting out much quicker than in the ancient world where, hey, we've got news. All right, get a piece of papyrus out, we'll get a quill and maybe some ink, and we'll see if we can write it down and send it to someone else. It took a lot more time for information to spread. If you ever wonder why, if you look at the world and say you're like 800 and the same world in 1100 and not too much changes, things did change. I have a degree in history, so I can say that. Things did change substantially, but the difference between 800 and 1100 in many ways in the average life of a person, I would say, is a less drastic change than the difference between someone living in 1950 and 1980. 300-year difference, 30-year difference. Completely different worlds. Okay? I think of my own great-grandfather was born in the 1860s and died in the 1960s. Can you imagine being born in the Civil War and dying in the Civil Rights Movement? It's unbelievable to me. Okay, that much change in a century. That might be the most dynamic period. Maybe, I don't know what the future holds, but it could be the case. Maybe I'm just feeling that. Well, the point that I want to emphasize here is the notion of the feeling of truth, and that's the notion of truthiness, as opposed to what what is truth. This is a question. There's a in the Gospel of John in the New Testament. There's this peculiar exchange between uh, Jesus of Nazareth and Pontius Pilate, where he says, that is, Jesus says, like, you know, I could not do what I'm doing unless the authority above me had sent me to do it. And through the course of their exchange, Pilate ends up asking Jesus the question, like, Jesus says, like, this is the truth. Elsewhere, Jesus has said in the Gospel of John, I am the truth. And Pilate asks the question in Greek, ti estin aletheia, or in Latin, quid est veritas, or in Church Latin, quid est veritas. What is truth? Ti estin aletheia. What is truth? Interestingly, Jesus doesn't really answer him. It's just kind of left there as a dangling question. Well, what is truth? And philosophers have wrestled with that for centuries. So there have been periods up to, especially in the 16th, 17th, 18th centuries, people like Descartes. You know what's really certain? There's a tendency going back all the way to Parmenides in ancient Greece, Pythagoras, Plato, going all the way up to Descartes, Baruch Spinoza, Gottfried Leibniz. Truth is math, because math you can't argue with. 2 plus 2 is 4. You can't argue with that. You can try. Triangle has 3 sides. Triangle has 4 sides? Nope. Math is certain. Ethics are sloppy, right? We've talked about this before when we were talking about Immanuel Kant. It seems like ethics has less of a certainty, but how much of our ethical knowledge is predicated upon this? Feelings and truthiness. That's what I want to get at with this. Okay, and then talk about it with engineering ethics. So let's start with ethics first, and talking about truthiness. You know, often, someone like G.E. Moore, analytic philosopher, will talk about this too. Often it seems like when we're talking about ethics, really what we're doing often is when we're saying, like, that's bad, that's evil, that's wrong, what somebody did, it's really just saying, that feels bad to me. And when we talk about something doing good, it's just a matter of it, like sentimentality. It feels good. We do this with our own ethical values. We like doing the things that make us feel good. That's why we can do bad things that make us feel good. And we're like, yeah, no one else will like this, but it feels good to me. As long as no one else knows about it, then I'll feel bad. And I won't like it then. But that's how we kind of do our ethics. We might have these big systems like I was talking about earlier in the semester: deontology, utilitarianism, virtue ethics, Christian ethics, Islamic ethics, okay, Jewish ethics, Hindu ethics, Vedanta. We might have those systems, but really, even when we embrace those overarching systems, it's not like we stop and go, wait, time out. I have to think about this particular ethical issue. Does this actually match up with my system? Most of what we do is just based on feeling. No, we don't like that. God doesn't like that. God is not feeling this right now because I'm not feeling it. We feel repulsed, and that's what it is. We have we have feelings of approbation. I like that, and then we have feelings of revulsion. That's nasty, and that's really what we do with ethics. Really, our ethics are feelings of and that's what we do. Much of our ethical contact is based on truthiness. Even if we have systems that undergird it, our visceral responses are based on kind of a thumbs up or a thumbs down, so to speak. Now, what that means is, when we're applying this to engineering ethics, whether we're talking about infrastructure or vaccines, or, you know, what should, right now during this pandemic, should certain companies be doing certain things? Should companies that, now some companies have done this, for example, some companies that make vodka are making hand sanitizer instead. They have the means to do so. There's actually not that much of a difference between vodka and hand sanitizer, so it's pretty easy. Should companies like Tesla that make electric cars, should they be making ventilators and respirators for hospitals? I'm not asking should they be compelled to do so. I'm saying like through some sort of state action. I'm asking, are they morally obliged to do so? And if they do so, one, what ethical or meta-ethical system is in place mandating that stuff we talked about earlier in the semester, one. And two, is there some sense of, like, because a company did something, like, oh, that feels good. I feel like they did the right thing. And does that feeling make it true, right, or good? So that brings us to the notion of bullshit, which we'll get to in just a moment. All right, now I want to look at just a little bit of Harry Frankfurt's on bullshit. This is up on Blackboard. We'll take a look at a little. This is a lengthy, short book, lengthy essay, but I want to look at parts of it where he's talking about the notion of bullshit. And I'm just going to go through a few parts of this, and I want to relate the notion of bullshit to truthiness and truth and how we talk about things. I like this opening here. He says this is Frankfurt philosopher. One of the most salient features of our culture is that there is so much bullshit. Everyone knows this. Each of us contributes his share, but we tend to take the situation for granted. Most people are rather confident of their ability to recognize bullshit and to avoid being taken in by it. So the phenomenon has not aroused much deliberate concern, nor attracted much sustained inquiry. In consequence, we have no clear understanding of what bullshit is, why there is so much of it, what functions it serves, and we lack a conscientiously developed appreciation of what it means to us. In other words, we have no theory. I propose to begin the development of a theoretical understanding of bullshit, mainly by providing some tentative and exploratory philosophical analysis. So, that's where he starts saying bullshit's everywhere. Let's take a look at what it is. And so I'm going to kind of skim through what this is, and he uses a lot of Max Black's The Prevalence of Humbug from, I want to say, the early 1980s to kind of make his point. And he says humbug is sort of like an old-fashioned way of saying the exact same thing as bullshit. So you can think of Ebenezer Scrooge saying humbug, and if you put it in modern language, it'd be the same thing as saying bullshit. I can think of now A Christmas Carol, bullshit to Merry Christmas, or something like that. So what are I like these? Here are some synonyms: humbug, balderdash, claptrap, hokum, drivel, buncombe, imposture, quackery. Sure, pick your term. Here's how Black defines humbug: deceptive misrepresentations, short of lying, especially by pretentious word or deed, of somebody's own thoughts, feelings, or attitudes. That's Max Black's definition of humbug. We could say the same thing. What is bullshit? Deceptive misrepresentation, short of lying, especially by pretentious word or deed, of somebody's own thoughts, feelings, and attitudes. So there's a sense in which bullshitting is not the same kind of malevolent lying. You might say that in response. Someone lies and you say bullshit. But bullshitting as a verb is a little bit more of something more nuanced. It's this. So here, let's break down some of those elements as Frankfurt does. Deceptive misrepresentation. This may sound pleonastic. No doubt what Black has in mind is that humbug is necessarily designed or intended to deceive, and its misrepresentation is not merely inadvertent. In other words, it is deliberate misrepresentation. So kind of like straw manning. That is to say, when you misrepresent what somebody's saying, and you're like, oh, this person says that, like someone says, like, hey, I think we should maybe spend more money, tax money on education. Oh, you hate America. You love communism. You love the destruction of America. You love the death of American troops. No, I didn't say that. I think we should do this. Deliberate misrepresentation. That would be an example of that. Now, if, as a matter of conceptual necessity, an intention to deceive is an invariable feature of humbug, then the property of being humbug depends at least in part upon the perpetrator's state of mind. It cannot be identical, accordingly, with any properties, either inherent or relational, belonging just to the utterance by which the humbug is perpetrated. So it's an intentional misrepresentation. It's not just bullshit. It's not just misrepresentation. It's where you're trying to deceive in a description. That's one aspect of it. Let's go forward a little bit. What's another aspect of it? It's short of lying. So it's not quite, you could say it's deception in a certain sense, but it's not the same kind of thing as, even though it's intentional misrepresentation, it's still not lying in the same sense. Like if I asked George Washington, did you chop down the cherry tree? And he did. No. That's lying. It's still, even intentional misrepresentation can be something, it's different from lying. Because it must be the point of saying that humbug or bullshit is short of lying, that while it has some of the distinguishing characteristics of lies, there are others that it lacks. But this cannot be the whole point. After all, every use of language without exception has some, but not all, of the characteristic features of lies. That is, there's a certain sense in which almost all language involves some kind of deception, like, like sarcasm. Like someone says, like, hey, how you doing today? And you go, great. And you're being sarcastic. Like, you're not doing great today, but you say great. Well, I mean, are you lying? Are you deceiving me? Is that perjury? No, but there's a certain sense in which that's deceptive in a way, but it doesn't have all the, you're not intending to deceive to create some set of circumstances that's beneficial to yourself, like it's to communicate. So further, yet it would surely be incorrect to describe every use of language as short of lying. Black's phrase evokes the notion of some sort of continuum, so like a spectrum of, yeah, here's a spectrum of deception. Maybe there's lying over here, sarcasm's in there somewhere, misrepresentations in there somewhere, omissions in there somewhere. So omission can be a kind of deception in certain circumstances. Like, did you do this? You don't say anything. It's not lying per se, but it's not telling the truth either. So there's that. Further, especially by pretentious word or deed, there are 2 points to notice here. First, Black identifies humbug or bullshit not only as a category of speech, but as a category of action as well, may be accomplished either by words or by deeds. Second, his use of the qualifier especially indicates that Black does not regard pretentiousness as an essential or wholly indispensable characteristic of humbug. Undoubtedly, much humbug is pretentious. So far as concerns bullshit, moreover, pretentious bullshit is close to being a stock phrase. That's pretentious bullshit. But I'm inclined to think that when bullshit is pretentious, this happens because pretentiousness is its motive rather than a constitutive element of its essence. Like it's pretentious because it's trying to be, and bullshit is always kind of pretentious in a way. And then this, a misrepresentation of somebody's own thoughts, feelings, or attitudes. This provision that the perpetrator of humbug is essentially misrepresenting himself raises some very essential issues. To begin with, whenever a person deliberately misrepresents anything, he must inevitably be misrepresenting his own state of mind. It is possible, of course, for a person to misrepresent that alone, for instance, by pretending to have a desire or a feeling which he does not actually have. But suppose that a person, whether by telling a lie or another way, misrepresents something else, then he necessarily misrepresents at least 2 things. He misrepresents whatever he's talking about, that is, the state of affairs, that is the topic of reference of his discourse, and in doing so he cannot avoid misrepresenting his own mind as well. So this is another aspect of bullshit. You end up misrepresenting something else, but also you actually end up misrepresenting whoever's speaking ends up misrepresenting themselves. Jacques Lacan had the phrase, French phrase, méconnaissance, very related to the word reconnaissance. Like you might go on a reconnaissance mission to find out what's out there. What does reconnaissance mean? Literally recognize what's out there. That's a reconnaissance mission. For Lacan, méconnaissance is misrecognition. You can completely get a wrong sense of what's out there. If you ever something as simple as, let's say you're looking at something in the dark and you think especially when you're a child, and you see, maybe a chair on the other side of the room. It looks like, I don't know, a monster in the dark, and you go, oh, it's scary. Well, you're misrespecting in a certain sense, the thing that's there as something else. That's a méconnaissance, a misrecognition. Well, in bullshit and in humbug, what we often do is misrepresent our own notions. We think one thing, but we kind of say another one because we're misunderstanding our own thoughts on the issue. If the lie works, then its victim is twice deceived, having one false belief about what it is in the liar's pocket, and another false belief about what it is in the liar's mind. Let's skip forward a little bit. Page, I think, 52. So I got a ways to go. Zoom forward a little bit. For a little more. Super close. Here we go. Let's take a look at this thought. Yeah. Now he's doing this in the sense of a comparison, but let's take a look at what Frankfurt says here. Page 52, 59 of the PDF, 52 of the actual essay. On the other hand, a person who undertakes to bullshit his way through something has much more freedom. His focus is panoramic rather than particular. That is, the bullshitter is trying to kind of like let's kind of gloss over everything rather than something very specific. That's what it means by panoramic as opposed to something particular. He does not limit himself to inserting a certain falsehood at a specific point, and thus he is not constrained by the truth surrounding that point or intersecting it. He's prepared, so far as required, to fake the context as well. This freedom from the constraints to which the liar must submit does not necessarily mean, of course, that his task is easier than the task of the liar, but the mode of creativity upon which it relies is less analytical and less deliberative than that which is mobilized in lying. It is more expansive and independent, with more spacious opportunities for improvisation, color, and imaginative play. This is less a matter of craft than of art. That is, it's not just a knack. This is something that takes real skill. So as craft and art, like a lot of us can, do a craft. I can glue some popsicle sticks together, but I'm not painting the Sistine Chapel. Okay, that's the difference between craft and art. Those are similar words in ancient Greek and Latin, though. But that's the distinction between a craft and art. Craft is kind of just an ability, a knack. Really, you could say an art, exquisite skill. The bullshitter is kind of an artist, as opposed to the liar who has kind of a craft. Hence, the familiar notion of the bullshit artist. My guess is that the recommendation offered by Arthur Simpson's father, in the context he was talking about before, reflects the fact that he was more strongly drawn to this mode of creativity, regardless of its relative merit or effectiveness, than he was the more austere and rigorous demands of lying. What bullshit essentially misrepresents is neither the state of affairs to which it refers, nor the beliefs of the speaker concerning the state of affairs. Those are what lies misrepresent, by virtue of being false. Since bullshit need not be false, because it has to do with misrepresentation, not necessarily of facts, but of the way in which I'm relating to those facts, it differs from lies in its misrepresentational intent. The bullshitter may not deceive us, or even intend to do so, either about the facts or about what he takes the facts to be. What he does necessarily attempt to deceive us about is his enterprise. That is, why you're talking to us about this in the first place. That's what bullshit is. A bullshitter can talk about true things. You can think of many speeches throughout history. I could say a bunch of things that are true, nothing that you could disagree with, but I'm saying them in a certain context, or one can be saying them in a certain kind of way in order to get at something specific, or to get a specific spin on something, even if nothing that I say is untrue. Bullshit is getting at this deception of why we're talking about this in the particular way of talking about it. His or hers only indispensably distinctive characteristic is that in a certain way he misrepresents what he's up to. This is the crux of the distinction between him and the liar. Both he, the bullshitter, and the liar represent themselves falsely as endeavoring to communicate the truth. The success of each depends upon deceiving us about that. But the fact about himself or herself is that the liar hides is that he is attempting to lead us away from a correct apprehension of reality. We are not to know what he wants us to believe, something he supposes to be false. The fact about himself that the bullshitter hides, on the other hand, is that the truth values of his statements are of no central interest to him. What we are not to understand is that his intention is neither to report the truth nor to conceal it. This does not mean that his speech is anarchically impulsive, but that the motive guiding and controlling it is unconcerned with how the things about which he speaks truly are. So bullshit here, bullshit is not the same thing as truthiness. Truthiness is that sense that something feels true, therefore it must be true because I feel it. And that's more kind of a sense of receiving information. I heard it, I feel it, that's what I believe. Bullshit, on the other hand, is something, it's less passive and more active. It's not something that involves patience or reception, but it involves agency and transmission. A bullshitter is not someone who just takes information in. They might take in bullshit, but bullshit is a kind of agency. It's something that transmits and goes outward, and it does exactly this. It's meant to be controlling about the contextualization about the way things are received. So again, it's about the transmission of information, where even every single line that's said might have a facticity to it. That is, it might be you can do the facts, and the individual facts are true, but they're construed in such a way as to be part of a kind of package or constellation. Okay? So when we talk about, and I think I said this earlier in the semester too, like a constellationization, you can have particular data points, but you try and present them as a package deal. I think the most obvious constellation, say, in the night sky is the constellation Orion. And there, you could see usually the three, Mintaka, the three stars in Orion's belt. You might be able to see Betelgeuse up here, Rigel over here. Those are the most obvious stars in the constellation Orion. And you could say, here's these various stars. this one's got, you could say this one's got this much magnitude. This one's a blue star. This one's a red giant. You can do all that stuff. All the facts are pretty much indisputable. But then you go, like, look, it has the shape of a dude. And you can see it and go, okay. But because in Greek civilization, they saw a guy up there. It looks like it's a guy hunting some other constellation that's up there. And it has the appearance of a man. It seems anthropomorphic. Does it? According to other civilizations, there are other constellations out there, other than the Greek one that we've kind of inherited in the West, where they kind of see the exact same dots, but they see something different. It's kind of like looking at clouds in the sky. Oh, I can think of the beginning of the Disney film Up. Where, they're looking at clouds at the beginning. Oh, you see this, and then they see all these babies. We can be looking at the exact same phenomenon and package it in a different way. So again, why am I saying that? Because there's different ways to receive the same set of facts. Facts are themselves molded into particular packages and situations and sets. Sometimes we call these sets theories, sometimes we call these sets paradigms, sometimes we call these sets ideologies. It kind of depends on what kind of informational or data sets that they are. But we do this, and really the bullshit is kind of supposing that the facts are not in dispute, but that the packaging of these facts is in dispute. We can kind of be capricious, or if you will, more colloquially, wishy-washy about the way that we present them. So again, bullshit is a kind of presentation of misinformation that doesn't dispute the facts, but kind of disrupts their context and their packaging, so to speak, their presentation, their representation. The Germans would use the word Vorstellung here, whereas lying is saying a fact is not a fact. Someone murders someone else and says, I didn't murder him. But bullshitting might be like, well, what had happened was, you see, there was a lot of stuff going on in the background, like this person really angered me, and, well, yeah, sure, I did kill them. That's not in dispute. But the reason why I killed them is because I was defending myself. Because I had been not defending myself in the sense of self-defense, but defending myself in the sense that I was defending my honor. What I was doing there was bullshit. I wasn't denying, instead of not having killed anybody, let me say that right now. But in this hypothetical scenario, that's kind of what bullshit is. Bullshitting is the presentation of a recontextualization of the facts. It's not to dispute the facts, but it's to recontextualize the way that the facts work. Okay, or recontextualization. When I say recontextualization, I mean kind of mix around the way the packaging is. Marketing does this all the time. You can have, like, if here's an example. I think packaging really changes the phenomenon. I know we say often, don't judge a book by its cover. Pick any fantasy novel written in 1980. Okay, like genre fantasy. Okay, in the 1980s. Like, I don't know, a Terry Brooks novel or something. I mean this. Go look at its original 1980s cover, and then go look at its cover that it has now. And I guarantee you, the original 1980s cover will look terrible. You can think, oh, things from the 1980s, like vintage is a thing. Look at book covers from like the 1970s and 80s, and look at the book covers for the same books now, and you will want to read the book now more than you want to read the book from the 1970s, even if nothing between the inside of the front cover and the back cover has changed. Like nothing. Like it's the exact same words, exact same pagination, everything else. You'll want to read the new one rather than the old one. Why? Because of its cover. You might think the stuff on the inside, that hasn't changed. Don't judge a book by its cover. The story is great. Yeah. Covers of books affect you. People in marketing know this. Contextualization is a huge factor. Okay, you can have two people say the exact same thing, the exact same words, with the exact same accent and the exact same mannerisms. Put them in two different sets of clothes or two different persons. You'll get two very different responses. Okay, so that's the notion of bullshit. I think that's where I want to stop with this here, to kind of just give us a flavor of that. All right, now we've talked about truthiness, truth, and bullshit. What I want to do with that is apply that to engineering ethics now. So we've talked about various meta-ethical theories. We've talked about notions of belief when it comes to William Clifford and William James. When we're looking at what you were doing in your case study reports, when we're looking at an incident, how do we talk about it? How do we communicate about it? When we see something like conspiracy theories. Now, I mentioned stuff like, oh, the Earth is flat. That doesn't get you anywhere. The problem with conspiracy theories and what makes them conspiracy theories is not the presentation of alternate hypotheses. Science works well with alternative hypotheses. People saying, oh, we think that's really how a lot of investigative science, what I'll call exploratory science, works. That's not how it works typically. Usually what scientists do is they repeated experiments of the same phenomenon. Most scientists aren't confirming new theories. Most scientists spend their day applying theories that are already in practice. That's called what Thomas Kuhn calls everyday science. Then there's extraordinary science, where we're coming up with new scientific theories. We've got something new is proposed and then it's explored. That's usually not how science works. No, sometimes we think of science as a linear kind of progression, like things get better and better and better and better, and it's really more of kind of a bouncing around, and sometimes a bouncing around between different theoretical models. That's how science works, surely. And like I said, alternative hypotheses being presented, nothing wrong with that. That's why I have no problem with people saying that the Earth is flat. I think it's stupid. But I don't really have a problem with people at least saying that. And then sometimes the flat earthers actually have created some interesting experiments trying to prove the hypothesis that the Earth is flat. Some of them are actually pretty inventive at trying to get at the truth. Some of them are stupid. Like, when Houston flooded a couple of years ago, I remember, it might have been, I can't remember if it was a year ago or 2 years ago, when Houston, Texas flooded. Someone poured water onto a plate and said, oh, you see the water on the plate? See how it stays there? That's because the plate is flat. The Earth is flat. That's why Houston flooded. That doesn't work, okay? Because if you got a big enough ball and you pour water on one spot of it, the water's going to stay there if the wall's big enough. If you pour it on a little tiny ball, which is what happened in this experiment, someone had like a baseball, poured water on it. Oh, the water doesn't stick on it. There's no flattening of the water. You didn't have a big enough ball to make this experiment work. But some of the experiments are pretty inventive. That's fine. The problem is that when you have, and I said this earlier in the semester too, when we were talking about the nature of scientific inquiry, is that if you have a theoretical model or a scientific theory, and you can't do anything with it, it doesn't really serve a function. It's not to say that scientific knowledge is reducible to pragmatism, to say that if you can't do something with it, then it's not worthwhile, necessarily. But if you can't do something with it, why hold it? So, for example, the theory, I won't call it a theory, I'll call it a hypothesis, that vaccines cause autism. Nothing can support that. There's no theories that support that other than truthiness. It feels like they do. People get more, there's more autism, ADD, ADHD than there ever has been. Also, there's more vaccines than there ever has been. There has to be a connection. Or, like I said, the hypothesis that the coronavirus is caused by 5G networks. We didn't have 5G networks until just now. We didn't have the coronavirus, COVID-19, until just now. There must be some kind of a connection. The example I use with this is sometimes called post hoc ergo propter hoc, or post hoc ergo propter hoc. Correlation does not equal causation. Consider the following argument. Those of you who had me for logic before, this will be a familiar argument to you. If I say, hey, in the last 500 years, the recordings of the Earth, of the Earth's temperature, demonstrate that the Earth, on the whole, has been getting hotter every year for the last 5 centuries, or since it's been recorded. Okay, the Earth is getting a little bit hotter and hotter and hotter. For the sake of this argument, I'm not saying that's indicative of climate change. We'll just say in terms of recorded measurements, hotter averages every year. Okay? Fact number one, it's a fact. Fact number two, the number of pirates in the world, okay, and I'm talking pirates like people, parrot on the shoulder, one leg, eye patch, Berberi pirates, North Africa. I mean, there's people pirating online, and there's still pirates today off the coast of, say, Somalia. There's still pirates in the world that seize ships, but pirates in the sense like when you think of like Pirates of the Caribbean, right? Those kind of pirates. They've diminished in the last 500 years, okay? There's not pirates going after, say, like the Maltese Falcon or something like that in the Mediterranean Sea, going, "Arr, we're going to steal your treasure." Those kinds of pirates have diminished in the last 500 years. To then say, well, since pirates have gone down, but the temperature of the Earth has gone up, there must be a connection. I've got it. Pirates cool the Earth. Now, based on the data, you could say, hey, it seems like there's a connection between those two facts and those two trajectories. There must be. Okay, sure, let's take that. Now, what can we do with that? We want to cool the Earth down, and we're going to start making more pirates? Is that what we're going to do? And to kind of have that kind of impetus, that's what we have to do. Like, we need, let's create pirate schools where people can learn how to be pirates, and that's how we'll have a cooler summer by the time we get to 2040. You're not going to be able to do anything with that, okay, because there's no corroborating evidence to demonstrate that this hypothesis is true, and you're never going to find that corroborating evidence. And that's part of the issue with this kind of bullshitting stuff. That's why when it comes to, say, something like infrastructure, well, it's American-made, it'll be fine. No. Easy. Second law of thermodynamics. All closed systems are inclined towards entropy. Without maintenance, your bridges are going to fall apart. Without maintenance, like you can, no, my car is never going to need an oil change. Okay, then you're not going to have a car very soon. That's going to happen. It might not happen this year, but it's going to happen. You never get oil change in your car. Like, imagine you never get oil change, you never put gas in your car. Let's assume it's a combustion engine and not a Tesla. You never do any maintenance on your car is going to fall apart. Okay, even if you ever had a bike as a kid, if you didn't put bike grease on those chains are going to constantly. Anybody, you have a bike when you were growing up where the chains just constantly fell off because they were rusted as hell because you didn't maintain it. Like, that stuff's going to happen. We can say we know that with scientific knowledge. We're not going to believe in, no, there's oil change fairies. We don't need to change the oil. Everything's going to be fine. Nope. We have the scientific wherewithal to say that with confidence. Now, that doesn't mean that it's absolutely true at the end of the day. I think Willard Van Orman Quine is a philosopher who says this. That doesn't mean that the fundamental reality, when we're talking about scientific or theoretical models, that's actually the way the world is. It's not necessarily the case that atoms are the way they think we are, that stars are the way we think we are, the way we think they are, that evolution happened exactly as we think it did, but at least based on the models that we have right now, these are the best ways to explain phenomena, and we should do what we do in light of those particular models. That's the way we do science. And that's a kind of scientific pragmatism. Not that science gets at truth, capital T, but that we do the best we can with the data that we've got now. And that's why, if you look back, 500 years ago, as I said earlier in the semester with like geocentrism, when people thought the Earth was at the center of the solar system, they were still able to make accurate measurements and predictions. They could still figure out when eclipses were going to occur. They could still figure out when is Saturn going to be here in the sky. Where they were wrong is the why of why things were happening. They could explain the phenomena. They could make predictive analyses, but they couldn't make as accurate predictions as we can today, nor could they make the same extent of predictions because they had no knowledge of, say, Uranus, Neptune, or Pluto astronomers. Okay? Today we have access to more information because of the advent of the theories that we possess now. That's why we can make better predictions. But just as, like, you can look at, look up, for example, when I was a kid, there was a dinosaur called the Brontosaurus. It was kind of like a Brachiosaurus. It was one of the big ones. It's kind of how I think of the dinosaur from Sid Hoff's Danny and the Dinosaurs, maybe a Brontosaurus. It turns out Brontosaurus was probably not a thing. That was a combination of different bones from different animals that paleontologists had discovered. And then even if you look at various models of dinosaurs by paleontologists over the last 100 years, the way that the bones come together in different shapes has changed over time. Like when I was a kid, the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. They were these giant lizard things that were skinny and terrifying. Granted, that's a work of fiction, but even the paleontologists said that, that dinosaurs were almost these lizard-looking things. And even the film Jurassic Park talks about, the dinosaurs are more like birds. And today, if you look at the model of what, say, a Tyrannosaurus Rex looks like, it looks more like a giant chicken. It's got a more fatty body and feathers. The way I've looked at this before, I think I might have said this here. Look up, I'm going to say, just Google the skeleton of a penguin. Just look at penguin skeleton. Just look at the skeleton by itself. And when you look at it, think of what someone would think a penguin looked like just based on the skeleton alone, because it's got a long, its neck goes almost into its, but like its spine until you get to its wing bones. It looks like a dinosaur. Okay, and if I think of like a paleontologist looking at a penguin skeleton going, it must have looked like something like a velociraptor. Well, how are we getting the information that dinosaurs were probably had fattier bodies and probably feathers? From other kinds of fossils, from the addition of new data. So constantly looking after new data, expanding on the models, sometimes revising the models. That's rarer, but sometimes that does happen. Okay, and that's called, Thomas Kuhn would call that a paradigm shift. What does that have to do with engineering? Constantly wanting to get new information, to update the data that we have, to update what we can say about what's going on in the world. One of the problems that we have when it comes to engineering ethics now, even right now, is this conflict with sentimentality, truthiness, and bullshit. And I want you to think of how this applies right now. I think it's entirely appropriate to think about how this applies to the COVID-19 situation. We can talk about the responses of various corporations. Okay, like I mentioned before, certain corporations that make vodka now making hand sanitizer. Some corporations making respirators and ventilators and those kinds of things, and how much are needed. And right now there's a huge discussion about the model. You've heard of flattening the curve. How do we get these models? And I live in Georgia, where by the time of this recording, it will start that things are about to reopen in Georgia, because, well, the curve's kind of being flattened and deaths should go down. And why should these scientific, I've heard people say in dissent, like, well, these scientific models saying that more and more people are going to die, and people are not dying. And so, since the deaths haven't been as high in some places as scientists said they're going to be, we shouldn't trust those models. Well, a lot of those models aren't as disastrous because of the measures that have been put in place. And someone might say, well, how could we possibly know that? Well, because that's how viruses work. That's epidemiology. That's been part of the critique of a lot of the dissemination of this discussion, especially on the internet. I know this is on the internet right now, but there have been various Dr. Oz, Dr. Phil saying, we don't shut the economy down for car crashes, and more people die from car crashes and cancer than they do from COVID-19. Yeah, but when was the last time someone was in a car crash and their car crash was contagious and affected you? When was the last time someone died of cancer and then you got cancer like that? It's not communicable in the same way. The reason viruses are different in this kind of way is they are more communicable. That is, they can be communicated, not through speech, but they can be spread. And also, what makes this virus different is, unlike, say, something like the regular flu, granted the regular flu, if you zoom in on that, is actually a couple of different things, is that there are vaccines against the flu. There are not vaccines against other things. Okay, there's no vaccine yet against, say, something like HIV, but HIV spreads in a very particular kind of way. It's less communicable than, say, COVID-19. COVID-19 is easily spreadable through droplets in the breath. That's why masks are recommended. And I remember I had to go to the store a couple of days ago, and I had my little mask on, and some uninformed, forgive me, dipshit was saying, well, you shouldn't have a mask on unless you've got it, because that's what masks are for. That means you must have it. If you don't have it, you shouldn't be wearing a mask. I would love someone to use that kind of logic with, say, like a condom. Like, well, if you don't have a disease, you shouldn't use a condom because that means you're not infected. It's just absolute bullshit. In terms of the way that we talk about these things. So what I want you to do, and you're going to have an essay question on this too, is the application of these notions of truthiness and bullshit to talking about how we're dealing with engineering ethics right now. Now, some of this involves corporations doing particular things. Some of this involves the government doing particular things. And there's pretty much all the stuff that we're talking about at the beginning of the semester is going on right now when it comes to governmental responses, when it comes to things like the stimulus, or additional stimuluses, not just in this country, but globally. And that's another thing that makes this interesting, is this is not a regional event, this is a global event. Or corporations, or even ourselves, like, what do my employers owe to me? I have a lot of friends who are in the service industry, people who are back waiters, servers, cooks, who life is hard for them right now. It's not engineering ethics, but what obligations do employers have? What obligations do governments have? What obligations do corporations have? What obligations do engineers have for what they're doing? Yeah, now, engineers are not necessarily medical doctors. There are some where there's a crossover. But what would be, in this situation, the obligation of engineers? Because medical doctors are not the ones who produce the ventilators or respirators. Is there some kind of new respirator or ventilator? Should that stuff be expedited? New kinds of technologies? Looking at new kinds of vaccines? New kinds of medical treatment? Like there's been, I can't remember the name of it, but there's been some kind of chemical compound that escapes me right now that has been promulgated as maybe it's kind of a cure against COVID-19, so maybe more people should be trying it. Well, where is the responsibility of the engineers and manufacturers here? Like the medical scientists have the medical doctors have their own kind of domain in terms of the way that they do testing, and that's analogous to what engineers are doing. But what are the obligations of engineers here? Okay, even like when I go into the store and there's some sort of like plastic or plexiglass shield between me and the cashier, as perhaps there should be. Where do those come from? How do they get manufactured? Is it irresponsible to produce, say, nitrile or vinyl gloves and send them to mechanics right now as opposed to hospitals? What should happen with those kinds of materials, with those kinds of masks? Should they be limited in quantity to some other people? Maybe I want to spray paint my, I don't know, maybe I want to spray paint something in my garage this weekend. Should I be entitled to get some kind of masks so that I don't breathe in various kinds of inhalants, or should those masks go elsewhere? Who's in charge of that kind of regulation? Should engineers help find some way to produce more? Should we be 3D printing stuff? Okay, and is there a moral impetus to come up with things in an independent or even a corporate way to respond to this kind of situation? This is very much the domain of engineering ethics. Or even the construction of 3D printers, the making of 3D printers themselves. All right, is that something that should be more accessible? Should I be able to 3D print my own ventilators at home if I need to? My own masks? Different subject matter. My own guns? Should I be able to 3D print my own gun at home? And if I can, and let's say I'm a sociopath, who's responsible for that? Me, the one that prints it, or the person that makes 3D printers available and cheaper for people to have really in the home? Not entirely tangential, but very central to this question. So this is something, like I said, it's going to be on the exam. The exam questions will be up today. And I want to say here, transition at this point, there'll be a list of exam questions. It'll be shorter than the one for the midterm, I think, because we've done a little bit less stuff in the second half of the semester. But you'll only have to do 2 questions. So I'm going to say that as well elsewhere, but I want to say that here. So if you have other questions for me, I can be reached at thomasb@usca.edu. Furthermore, if you need to communicate with me in a Zoom meeting, we can still do that as well. All right, I've actually had very great conversations with some of you already. I'd be delighted to do more and explore some of these issues together with you. That's it. Tom Burris signing off. Like I said, more questions for me. thomasb@usca.edu. Bye-bye.